closing attorney looked down at the ownership documents, adjusted his glasses, and frowned. "I'm sorry," he said. "The sellers listed here don't own this property." My daughter-in-law's smile vanished. "What do you mean we don't own it?" she snapped. The buyers exchanged confused looks. My son leaned forward in his chair. "There has to be some mistake." The attorney shook his head. "There isn't." Then he looked toward the conference room door. Because at that exact moment I stepped inside. And for the first time in 10 years, my son and daughter-in-law learned who actually owned the house they had just tried to sell. But to understand how we got there, you need to know what happened the Christmas before. My name is Walter Jensen. I'm 72 years old. I live in a small town outside Columbus, Ohio. For most of my life, I worked as an electrical contractor. Nothing glamorous, just long days, hard work, and enough pride to know that every dollar I earned came from honest labor. My wife Margaret used to say I measured love in actions instead of words. Maybe she was right. When our son Michael was growing up, I wasn't the kind of father who gave long speeches about life. I fixed his bicycle. I showed up at baseball games. I worked overtime when college tuition came due. I was simply there whenever he needed me. Margaret passed away 12 years ago after a long fight with cancer. Anyone who's lost a spouse after 40 years of marriage understands what happens next. The house gets quieter. The days get longer. And every room carries memories. For 2 years after her death, I lived alone. Then Michael's business collapsed. He had opened a landscaping company with 2 partners. Things looked promising at first, but a bad economy, poor contracts, and one dishonest partner eventually destroyed everything. Within months, Michael and his wife Rachel were drowning in debt. I still remember the evening he came to see me. His shoulders looked heavier than I'd ever seen. "Dad," he said quietly, sitting across from me at my kitchen table, "I don't know what we're going to do." Rachel sat beside him. For once, she looked humble. They had 2 young children back then. Emily was 8. Josh was 6. The thought of those kids losing stability broke my heart. I told Michael I'd help, and I did. What neither of them knew was that I had already made a decision years earlier. After Margaret died, I sold our larger family home and purchased a smaller property across town through an LLC my attorney helped establish. Nothing illegal, nothing complicated. Just an estate planning arrangement designed to avoid future probate issues and family disputes. The house was comfortable. 4 bedrooms, a decent yard, good schools nearby. I offered it to Michael and Rachel. I told them they could live there for a small monthly payment that barely covered taxes and maintenance. I never mentioned that I owned it. At the time, it didn't seem important. Family was family, or so I thought. The first few years were good. We shared dinners. I attended school events. The grandchildren spent weekends in my room watching old Western movies. Rachel seemed grateful. Michael seemed relieved. For a while, it felt like we'd survived a difficult chapter together. Then things slowly began changing. Not overnight. That's the thing about family relationships. They rarely break all at once. They crack little by little. Rachel started making comments. Small comments, easy to ignore. We'd have more room if Walter didn't store so much stuff. Or, it must be nice not having to worry about a mortgage. At first, I laughed them off. I assumed stress was talking. But over the years, the comments became sharper, more personal, more frequent. One evening during dinner, she complained because I'd left a coffee mug in the sink. A coffee mug? You would have thought I'd burned down the garage. Michael sat there quietly while she lectured me. I remember looking at him, waiting, expecting him to say something, anything. Instead, he focused on his plate. That hurt more than Rachel's words. Because strangers don't owe you loyalty. Your children do. As time passed, family decisions happened without me. Vacations were planned without asking if I'd like to come. Furniture was moved from my room without permission. Birthdays became shorter visits. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. I noticed everything. Older people always do. We simply learn not to mention it. The grandchildren remained my bright spot. Emily and Josh still treated me like grandpa, still hugged me, still asked me for advice, still wanted stories. But even that began changing as they got older. Rachel gradually filled their schedules with activities that left little room for family time. Sometimes weeks passed without a meaningful conversation. The loneliness crept in quietly. One afternoon, I was repairing a loose fence board in the backyard when I overheard Rachel talking to a friend on speakerphone. I hadn't intended to listen. But certain words have a way of stopping you cold. "This house is holding us back," she said. I froze. Her friend asked something I couldn't hear. Rachel laughed. "No, seriously. Once we sell it, we'll finally move somewhere better." Sell it. I stood motionless beside that fence. My first thought was confusion. My second was disbelief, because Rachel sounded completely certain. as if she truly believed the house belonged to her and Michael. The conversation continued. She talked about larger homes, warmer states, profit from the sale, future plans. Every sentence revealed the same thing. She had absolutely no idea who owned the property. I finished the fence repair and went inside. Nobody noticed anything unusual. Nobody knew my heart was pounding. That evening, I sat alone in my room and stared at an old photograph of Margaret. It was one of my favorites. She was standing beside a lake, smiling at something outside the frame. I remember speaking aloud, something I still do sometimes. "Well, Maggie," I said softly, "looks like we've got ourselves a situation." For the first time in years, I began wondering whether keeping quiet had been a mistake. But I wasn't angry yet, mostly disappointed, because the real issue wasn't the house. The real issue was what Rachel's words revealed. Somewhere along the way, they had stopped seeing me as family and started seeing me as an obstacle. I didn't know then how far things would go. I didn't know Christmas was only months away. And I certainly didn't know that before the year ended, my own son would help hand me a suitcase and ask me to disappear. But the wheels were already turning, and the first crack had finally become impossible to ignore. After overhearing Rachel talk about selling the house, I spent several weeks convincing myself I had misunderstood. Maybe she was daydreaming. Maybe she was simply talking about possibilities. Maybe I was letting hurt feelings color what I'd heard. When you reach my age, you learn that not every battle deserves a response. Sometimes people say foolish things. Sometimes families go through difficult seasons. And sometimes patience solves problems that confrontation only makes worse. So I kept quiet. Life moved on. Summer turned into fall. The maple trees lining our street exploded into shades of red and gold. The grandchildren went back to school. The neighborhood settled into its usual rhythm. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary American family. Inside the house, however, something had changed. Rachel no longer bothered hiding her resentment. The comments became direct. One morning, she walked into the kitchen and sighed dramatically when she saw me drinking coffee. "You know," she said, opening the refrigerator, "most people your age prefer retirement communities." I looked up from my newspaper. "Most people my age probably do." She shrugged. "They have activities, friends, independence." The way she emphasized the last word told me exactly what she meant. I folded my newspaper. "Is there something you're trying to say, Rachel?" "No." She smiled, but it wasn't a smile. It was a warning. Over the next few months, similar conversations became common. Every inconvenience somehow became my fault. If the utility bill increased, I was using too much electricity. If the garage felt crowded, my belongings were taking up space. If family schedules became complicated, my presence somehow contributed to the problem. Michael never openly joined her attacks, but he rarely challenged them either. And silence can be just as painful as agreement. One Saturday afternoon, I invited Michael to lunch. Just the two of us. We went to a diner we'd visited dozens of times when he was younger. The same red boots, the same waitress who had worked there forever, the same smell of coffee and grilled sandwiches. For a little while, things felt normal again. We talked about football, the weather, his work, the grandchildren. Then I decided to say what had been weighing on my heart. "Mike," I said carefully, "can I ask you something?" He nodded. "Sure. Are things okay between us?" He looked surprised. "What do you mean?" I studied his face. The face I had watched grow from childhood into adulthood. The face that still carried traces of the little boy who once followed me around with a toy hammer. "I feel like you've been pulling away." He stared into his coffee. "No, Dad, that's not it." "Then what is it?" He hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. Finally, he sighed. "Rachel's under a lot of stress." I nodded slowly. "I know. She's trying to plan for the future." I waited. "And," he rubbed his forehead, "sometimes she feels like we're stuck." There it was. Not anger, not cruelty, something almost worse. Excuses, rationalizations, the slow surrender of a son who no longer wanted conflict in his marriage. I asked quietly, "And am I part of what's making her feel stuck?" Michael didn't answer immediately. His silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. It felt like 3 years. Finally, he said, "Sometimes." The word hit harder than I expected. Not because it was shouted. Not because it was meant to hurt, but because it was honest. I paid for lunch. We shook hands, and both of us pretended the conversation had gone better than it actually had. That evening, I sat in my room for a long time, not angry, just tired. I found myself thinking about all the years before, the overtime shifts, the missed vacations, the second mortgage Margaret and I took out to help pay Michael's college tuition, the money we'd quietly given him after his landscaping business failed. None of those sacrifices had ever felt like sacrifices at the time. That's what parents do. You help your children. You don't keep score. But sitting there alone, I couldn't ignore the uncomfortable realization growing inside me. Love doesn't require gratitude, but it does require respect, and respect was disappearing. A few weeks later, Thanksgiving arrived. The entire family gathered at the house. Rachel's relatives came over. Neighbors stopped by. The football game played in the background while everyone ate. At first, everything seemed pleasant. Then the conversation shifted toward retirement. One of Rachel's cousins asked whether I enjoyed having fewer responsibilities. I laughed. Depends on the day. Before I could say anything else, Rachel chimed in. Trust me, Walter doesn't have many responsibilities anymore. A few people chuckled politely. I smiled and let it pass. Then she added, sometimes I think having him around is like raising another teenager. The room went quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet enough. The kind of quiet that follows a joke nobody finds funny. I looked around the table. Several people avoided eye contact. A few forced nervous smiles. Then I looked at Michael, my son. He didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look uncomfortable. He simply kept eating. Something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just enough. Enough to recognize a truth I'd been avoiding. I was no longer being treated as family. I was being tolerated. And even that tolerance was running out. December arrived shortly afterward. Christmas decorations appeared around the neighborhood. Lights glowed from front porches. Holiday music played in stores. The grandchildren seemed excited. For their sake, I tried to stay positive. But Rachel's behavior continued getting worse. One evening, I walked through the living room and noticed papers spread across the dining room table. Real estate papers, property estimates, market comparisons, notes about selling prices. Rachel quickly gathered them when she noticed me, but not before I'd seen enough. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name was Frank Holloway. We'd known each other nearly 30 years. After explaining the situation, I met him at his office. Frank listened carefully. Then he reviewed the ownership records. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Walter, legally speaking, they can't sell the property. I know. They aren't listed as owners. I know. He studied me. Then why haven't you told them? That was the question, wasn't it? I stared out the office window. Because the answer wasn't legal. It was emotional. I keep hoping Michael will remember who he is. Frank nodded slowly. And if he doesn't? For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that possibility. The answer sat heavily in my chest. Then I suppose I'll have to. Frank closed the file. Whenever you're ready. I left his office feeling older than when I'd arrived. Not because of the house, not because of the paperwork. Because deep down I was beginning to understand something painful. The greatest threat to our family wasn't Rachel. It was Michael's willingness to stand beside her while she pushed me away. And unfortunately, the worst was still ahead, because Christmas Eve was coming. And my son was about to make a choice neither of us would ever forget. The weeks leading up to Christmas should have felt warm and familiar. Instead, they felt like a countdown. By then, I had stopped fooling myself. The tension in the house was no longer subtle. Rachel barely hid her irritation whenever I entered a room. Michael seemed permanently exhausted, caught somewhere between guilt and avoidance. And I spent more time in my room than ever before. Not because anyone ordered me to stay there. Not yet, but because it was easier. Easier than sitting through awkward silences. Easier than pretending everything was normal. Easier than watching my own family slowly make it clear that I no longer belonged. Still, I tried. For the grandchildren. I always tried for them. One Saturday afternoon, Emily knocked on my bedroom door. She was 16 by then, old enough to notice things adults thought they were hiding. Grandpa, come in. She sat on the edge of the bed. You okay? I smiled. Why wouldn't I be? She rolled her eyes. That made me laugh. Teenagers have a remarkable ability to ignore polite lies. You seem sad. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said the truth. Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. She nodded, as if she understood more than I realized. Then she hugged me. No words, just a hug. For a few seconds, the loneliness eased. I would think about that hug many times in the months ahead, because it reminded me that not everyone in the family had forgotten who I was. A few days later, I overheard another conversation. This time, Rachel wasn't speaking to a friend. She was speaking to a realtor. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was simply walking down the hallway when I heard her voice. The buyers are very interested. A pause. Then, yes, we're hoping to close shortly after New Year's. I stopped walking. The realtor must have asked a question. Rachel laughed confidently. Oh, ownership won't be a problem. I nearly smiled. If only she knew. The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. She genuinely believed she controlled everything. The house. The future. the family. She had no idea she was building plans on a foundation that didn't belong to her. For a brief moment, I considered revealing the truth, just ending the whole charade. But something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe disappointment, or maybe I needed to know whether Michael would eventually step forward and do the right thing. So I waited. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear. Ohio had received a light snowfall the night before. The neighborhood looked like a Christmas card. White rooftops, decorated trees, children pulling sleds through front yards, the kind of scene Margaret always loved. I missed her terribly that day, more than usual, because if she had been alive, none of this would have happened. She would have seen trouble months earlier. She always did. The house filled with relatives that evening. Rachel's family arrived first, then a few neighbors. The grandchildren moved between rooms carrying plates of food and wrapped gifts. Everyone smiled. Everyone laughed. From the outside, we looked happy. Inside, I felt strangely detached, like I was watching someone else's life. Dinner passed without incident. The grandchildren opened presents. People exchanged hugs. Photographs were taken. For a few hours, everything seemed almost normal. Then the guests began leaving, one by one. Coats disappeared from hooks. Cars backed out of driveways. Voices faded. By 10 o'clock, only 4 of us remained. Me, Michael, Rachel, and silence. The atmosphere changed immediately. You know how some moments announce themselves before anything happens? This was one of those moments. Rachel looked toward Michael. Michael looked toward the floor. My stomach tightened. "Can we talk?" Rachel asked. I nodded. "Of course." She gestured toward the living room. I followed them, and that's when I saw it. A suitcase. Standing beside the front door. At first I didn't understand. Then I did. The realization hit me so suddenly I felt physically cold. Rachel sat down. Michael remained standing. Neither looked comfortable, but neither looked surprised either. This had been planned, discussed, agreed upon. Rachel folded her hands. "We've been talking about the future." I said nothing. "We think it's time for some changes." Still I remained quiet. She continued. "We need more space." Michael nodded. "We need privacy." Michael nodded again. Every nod felt like another door closing. Then Rachel finally said what she'd clearly rehearsed. "We think you'd be happier somewhere else. Somewhere else. Not another room. Not another arrangement. Gone." Michael finally spoke. "Dad, there are some nice senior apartments nearby." I looked at him. The little boy who once begged me to check under his bed for monsters. The teenager whose broken heart I helped mend after his first serious breakup. The young man I bailed out when his business collapsed. Now he couldn't even look me in the eye. I asked quietly, "Is this what you want?" His answer took several seconds. Then he nodded. "Yeah." One word. One devastating word. Rachel pointed toward the suitcase. "We packed some essentials, as if I were a guest checking out of a hotel." Then she smiled. A smile I'll never forget. "The best gift you can give us is to disappear." The room became very still. Outside, snow drifted past the windows. Inside, my entire understanding of my family changed. I looked at Michael one last time, waiting, praying, giving him one final opportunity to stop this, to say something. Anything. He didn't. His silence was his answer. Oddly enough, I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't remind them of everything I'd sacrificed. I didn't reveal ownership of the house. I simply stood up, picked up the suitcase, and walked toward the door. Rachel looked relieved. Michael looked miserable. Neither tried to stop me. The cold air hit my face as I stepped outside. The neighborhood was quiet. Christmas lights glowed across the snow-covered street. For a moment, I stood there holding that suitcase. A 72-year-old man carrying his life in a single bag, thrown out of a house he actually owned. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't hurt so much. I drove to a small motel about 20 minutes away. Nothing fancy, just a clean room and a bed. After checking in, I sat alone on the edge of the mattress. The silence felt enormous. For 12 years since Margaret's death, I'd carried grief. But this felt different. This was betrayal. And for the first time in a very long while, I cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The way old men cry when nobody is watching. Eventually, I wiped my eyes, looked at the clock, and made a decision. The waiting was over. The hoping was over. The excuses were over. I reached for my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and called the one person who already knew the truth. Frank Holloway, my attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Walter," I took a deep breath. "It's time. It's time." Frank was quiet for a moment after I spoke those words. Then he said exactly what I expected him to say. "Are you sure?" I looked around the motel room. The suitcase sat beside the bed. A suitcase my own family had packed for me. A suitcase they had handed me on Christmas Eve, as if I were an inconvenience that needed to be removed. For months I had hoped things would change. For months I had given Michael opportunity after opportunity to remember who he was. Now there was nothing left to wait for. Yes, I said. I'm sure. Frank exhaled slowly. All right. The next several weeks passed in a strange kind of calm. Not happiness, not anger. Just clarity. For the first time in a long while, I stopped trying to fix everyone else's choices. I rented a small furnished apartment on a month-to-month basis. Nothing fancy. Just enough space for a bed, a recliner, and a small kitchen table. Oddly enough, I felt more peaceful there than I had inside the larger house. No tension. No criticism. No walking on eggshells. Just silence. The kind of silence that heals instead of hurts. Emily called me twice during that period. The first time she sounded worried. "Grandpa, where are you?" I chose my words carefully. "I'm staying somewhere else for a while." Why? Children notice more than adults realize. Even teenagers, especially teenagers. I just needed some time. She wasn't convinced. Neither was I. But I wasn't about to drag her into the conflict. The second call came a week later. This time she sounded upset. "Mom says you're being stubborn." I almost laughed. Of all the words Rachel could have chosen. Stubborn. Not heartbroken. Not betrayed. Not abandoned. Stubborn. "Do you think I'm stubborn?" I asked. Emily was quiet. Then she said something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. "No." Just one word. But unlike her father's single word on Christmas Eve, this one carried kindness. A few days later, Frank called. "They've scheduled closing." I leaned back in my chair. When February 17th, the date hung in the air. After all the months of waiting, the moment was finally approaching. I wasn't excited. I wasn't nervous. Mostly I felt sad, because none of this should have happened. The truth is, revenge stories often sound satisfying from a distance. People imagine dramatic victories, humiliations, triumphant speeches. But real life isn't like that. When family relationships break apart, nobody truly wins. Someone always loses something valuable. Sometimes everyone does. Closing day arrived cold and gray. The title company occupied a modest office building near downtown Columbus. I arrived early. Frank met me in the parking lot. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I think so." He studied me for a second. "You don't have to go in there." "Yes, I do, because this wasn't really about property. It was about truth. And truth had waited long enough. We entered through a side entrance and remained in a separate conference room. The title company had already been instructed regarding ownership records. Everyone knew the documents would eventually reveal the problem. No one knew how dramatic the reaction would be. At 10 o'clock, Michael and Rachel arrived. Frank later told me Rachel looked excited. Apparently, she had already been discussing moving plans. New furniture, a larger home, a fresh start, all funded by proceeds from a sale that was never going to happen. The buyers arrived shortly afterward. A retired couple relocating from Pennsylvania. By all accounts, decent people. Completely unaware they had wandered into a family disaster. The closing began routinely. Documents were reviewed. Identification was checked. Signatures were prepared. Then the title attorney noticed the ownership discrepancy. At first there was confusion. A few minutes later there was concern. Then came the moment that changed everything. According to Frank, the attorney adjusted his glasses and said, "I'm sorry, but we have a problem." Rachel frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The listed sellers do not own this property." Silence. "What are you talking about?" Rachel asked. The attorney turned several pages. "The property is owned by Jensen Property Holdings, LLC. Michael leaned forward. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't." Rachel shook her head. "That's impossible." The attorney remained professional. "The records are quite clear." The buyers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody likes witnessing family conflict, especially strangers. Then the attorney said, "The managing member of the LLC is here today." And that's when Frank opened the conference room door. I stepped inside. Everything stopped. I will never forget the expressions on their faces. Rachel looked confused, then shocked, then frightened. Michael simply stared, as if his brain refused to process what he was seeing. I took a seat across from them. Nobody spoke. Finally, Rachel found her voice. "Walter?" I nodded. "Hello, Rachel. What is this?" Her confidence had completely vanished. The woman who had ordered me out of the house suddenly looked very small. I folded my hands calmly. "The house belongs to me." The words landed like a thunderclap. Michael's face turned pale. "No." "Yes." "Dad." I looked directly at him. For the first time in months, he couldn't look away. "I purchased the property 10 years ago." Nobody interrupted. So I continued. "I let you live there because I loved you. Still silence. I charge far less than market rent. Silence. I paid for repairs. Silence. I never asked for gratitude. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. The buyers quietly excused themselves from the room. I couldn't blame them. This wasn't their fight. Then I said the one thing that mattered most. All I ever expected was respect. Michael lowered his head. The room remained quiet for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "Oh my God, not because of the money. Not because of the failed sale. Because at that moment, he finally saw the full picture. The sacrifices. The years. The patience. The Christmas Eve suitcase. Everything." Rachel began apologizing. Rapidly. Emotionally. But I barely heard the words. Apologies offered after consequences arrive always sound different. Not necessarily insincere. Just late. Very late. Eventually, Michael looked at me. His eyes were red. "I'm sorry, Dad." For a moment, I saw the little boy again. The boy who once trusted me completely. And that made everything harder. Not easier. Harder. Because love never truly disappears. Even when trust does. I nodded slowly. "I know." Then I told them what would happen next. The living arrangement was over. They would need to find another place to live. I wasn't throwing them onto the street. I would give them reasonable time, but the arrangement was finished. The consequences of their choices had finally arrived. Nobody argued. Nobody protested, because there was nothing left to say. As the meeting ended, Michael remained seated, staring at the conference table, staring at the wreckage of a relationship he had helped destroy. And for the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. The truth was finally out. The strange thing about finally getting justice is that life doesn't suddenly become perfect afterward. Movies teach us that revenge comes with fireworks, a dramatic speech, a triumphant ending. Real life is quieter. The morning after the closing meeting, I woke up in the same small apartment. The same coffee maker sat on the kitchen counter. The same winter sunlight filtered through the blinds. Nothing looked different. And yet everything had changed. For months I had imagined that exposing the truth would make me feel victorious. Instead, I mostly felt tired. Not physically tired, emotionally tired. Because while I had protected my dignity, I had also accepted a painful reality. The family I thought I had no longer existed in the form I remembered. That realization takes time to process. Fortunately, time has a way of helping old wounds breathe. Spring arrived slowly in Ohio. The snow melted. The trees began turning green again. And for the first time in years, I started making decisions entirely for myself. Not for Michael. Not for Rachel. Not for anyone else. Just me. A few months after the closing disaster, I purchased a small home near a lake community about 40 minutes outside Columbus. It wasn't large. Actually, it was less than half the size of the old house, but it felt peaceful. The front porch overlooked the water. There was a walking path nearby, and most of my neighbors were retirees who understood something important. Life becomes much lighter when people stop competing and start appreciating. Within a few weeks, I found myself building routines. Morning walks, fishing, coffee with neighbors, volunteer work at a local veterans support center. Nothing extraordinary, just ordinary things that made life feel meaningful again. One afternoon, while helping organize donated supplies, I caught myself laughing at a joke one of the volunteers told. A real laugh, the kind that comes naturally. Not the polite kind, not the forced kind. The moment surprised me, because I realized something. For months I had been so focused on surviving betrayal that I had forgotten I was still allowed to enjoy life. That realization felt like freedom. Summer arrived, then autumn. The leaves changed colors once again, and slowly, very slowly, my anger faded. The memories remained, the lessons remained, but the anger lost its grip. That's one of the advantages of growing older. Eventually, you understand that carrying resentment hurts you more than the person you're angry with. Then in late October, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Michael's name. I stared at the screen. For several seconds, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered, "Hello?" There was a long pause. Then, "Dad," his voice sounded different. Quieter, older somehow. "Yes, I was wondering if I could see you. Not borrow money. Not ask for help. Not discuss the house. Simply see me." I thought about it. Then I agreed. We met the following weekend. At a small diner halfway between our homes. The same kind of place where ordinary Americans have solved family problems for generations. Nothing fancy, just coffee pie and uncomfortable honesty. Michael arrived early. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. The confidence he once carried was gone. In its place was something more genuine. Humility. After we ordered coffee, neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, he looked at me. "I'm sorry." I nodded. he continued, not rushing, not making excuses, not blaming Rachel, just speaking honestly. For nearly 20 minutes he apologized. He talked about his failures, his weakness, his fear of conflict, his willingness to prioritize peace in his marriage over doing what was right. Then he said something that stayed with me. I keep replaying Christmas Eve. I looked at him. His eyes were wet. Good. He seemed surprised. Good. Yes, he frowned. I continued gently. If it still hurts, that means you've learned something. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael nodded slowly. I think he understood. People often assume forgiveness means pretending something never happened. It doesn't. Forgiveness means acknowledging the damage while choosing not to live inside it forever. By the end of lunch, nothing was magically repaired. Trust doesn't work that way. Trust is built slowly, destroyed quickly, and rebuilt even more slowly. But something important had happened. We had started. Over the following months, our relationship improved little by little. Phone calls became more frequent. Visits became more comfortable. Conversations became more honest. Rachel remained distant at first. I couldn't entirely blame her. Embarrassment has a way of keeping people away, but eventually she reached out too. Her apology was quieter than Michael's, more hesitant, less polished. In some ways that made it more believable. I accepted it, not because she'd earned instant forgiveness, but because holding on to bitterness no longer served any purpose. Life is too short for that. Before long, Emily and Josh began visiting my lake house regularly. We fished, played cards, shared stories, and every time I watched them laughing on the porch, I felt grateful. Not for what had happened, but for what I had learned. The following Christmas arrived almost exactly 1 year after the suitcase incident. This time things looked very different. I hosted dinner at my home. Nothing extravagant, just family, good food, and honest conversation. At one point during the evening, I stepped outside onto the porch. The lake reflected the Christmas lights from nearby houses. The air was cold, peaceful, beautiful. For a moment, I thought about Margaret. I imagined what she would say, probably something simple, something wise, maybe something like, people show you who they are eventually, but don't let their mistakes change who you are. And she would have been right. Because the biggest lesson wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about ownership. It wasn't even about being right. It was about self-respect. For years, I confused love with endless sacrifice. I believed that being a good father meant enduring anything, accepting anything, excusing anything. I was wrong. Love matters. Generosity matters, but boundaries matter too. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for others is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. That lesson came late, but not too late. If you've ever been taken for granted, if you've ever struggled to choose between peace and self-respect, I hope this story reminds you that your value doesn't depend on someone else's appreciation. And if someone you love forgets what you've done for them, don't forget it yourself. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share a memory, a lesson, or an experience from your own life in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and finding strength after betrayal, consider subscribing and joining us for the next journey. Until next time, take care of yourself and remember that it's never too late to start a new chapter.